The spring of 1889 came late to Harrow Creek Valley. It always did. The mountains held the cold the way an old man holds a grudge long after everyone else had moved on. The high peaks kept their snow, and the wind that rolled down through the passes each morning reminded every homesteader in the valley that winter did not leave quietly. It retreated, slowly, grudgingly, like something that knew it would be back. Walter Greer stood behind his cabin on the morning of April the 3rd and watched the last of the ice melt from the creek bank below the south pasture. He was 63 years old. He had lived in this valley for 19 years. He had watched this same creek thaw 19 times, and every year it looked exactly the same. The gray ice softening at the edges, first then darkening, then breaking apart in slow, heavy chunks that floated downstream toward the lower meadows. The sound it made was low and irregular, a grinding patience like the valley itself clearing its throat after a long silence. Eleanor had loved watching the creek thaw. She used to stand right here in this same spot with her coffee going cold in her hands because she kept forgetting to drink it. She would watch the ice break up, and she would say the same thing every single year without fail, as if she were saying it for the first time. "There it goes, Walt. Another winter done." Walt stared at the creek for a long moment. Then he turned away. The coffee in his own cup had gone cold too. He had not noticed until just now. He looked at it and set it on the porch railing and did not drink it. The morning was clear and still, the kind of morning that arrives sometimes in early April. Like a promise the valley wasn't sure it could keep: bright sky, no wind, the smell of wet earth returning to itself after months of frost. By afternoon, the wind would likely come back. It usually did. He walked back to the cabin, set the cup on the porch railing, and looked at the north wall. He had been looking at the north wall a lot this spring. It was made from the same pine logs as the rest of the house, solid, well-fitted, chinked with clay, that he and Eleanor had packed in together the second autumn after they arrived. Good work, honest work, the kind that lasted. But the north wall faced the mountain directly. In winter, the wind came straight down off the high ridge line and hit that wall like something personal. Not just cold, angry cold. The kind that found every small gap between the logs, every place where the chinking had cracked slightly over the years, every thin spot where the wood had dried and pulled away from itself. The stove inside sat against the east wall, and it burned from morning until night, and still the corner nearest the north wall stayed cold enough that stored water sometimes iced overnight. Walt had hung a second wool blanket over the interior face of that wall 2 winters ago, and it had helped some, but not enough. Walt had burned through 2 full cords of wood every winter for the last several years. 1 cord more than most men his age in the valley. 1 cord more than he could comfortably cut and haul alone. Eleanor had never complained about the cold. That was the kind of woman she was. She would simply add another log and move closer to the stove and keep working on whatever she was doing, mending, preserving, reading, when the light was good enough, as if the cold were simply part of the contract you signed when you chose to live in a place this beautiful. She had a way of accepting difficulty without dramatizing it, a quality Walt had admired for 38 years, without ever finding the right words to say so directly. He had meant to tell her that eventually. He had assumed there was more time for it. Eleanor had been dead since January. Influenza. Quick and merciless the way it always was in mountain winters. She had been fine on a Monday and buried by the following Saturday in the frozen ground beneath the cottonwood tree at the edge of the east pasture. Walt had dug that grave himself with a pickaxe, breaking the ice crust inch by inch in the dark of a Wyoming January, and he had not cried while he did it because the cold was too severe for tears, and because there was work to be done, and because Eleanor would have said the same thing. "There's work to be done, Walt. Keep moving." He kept moving, but the north wall was still there. The cold was still there. 2 cords of wood every winter was still there. And now, for the first time in 19 years, Walt Greer was thinking about changing something. The idea had come to him in February. Not a dramatic idea, not the kind that arrives in a burst of light and clarity. It came the way most real ideas come to men who work with their hands slowly, quietly, while doing something else entirely. He had gone out to the root cellar behind the cabin to retrieve a sack of potatoes for supper. The root cellar was nothing special, just a hole in the ground lined with rough stones, covered with a timber door, weighted down with a flat rock. Every homesteader in the valley had one. You dug down past the frost line, and the earth did the rest, kept your vegetables from freezing in winter, kept them from rotting in summer. Stable temperature, year-round. It was one of the first things a man built when he settled a piece of ground in the Mountain West because without it, the first winter would eat you alive. Walt had opened the cellar door and climbed down the short ladder and reached for the potato sack, and that was when he noticed it. The air inside the cellar was warm, not warm like a heated room, warm like a living thing. A quiet, steady warmth that had nothing to do with fire and nothing to do with sunlight. The temperature above ground that evening was 18 degrees below zero. Inside the cellar, it felt closer to 45, maybe 50. The difference was not subtle, it was the difference between one world and another, separated by 6 feet of earth and a timber door. Walt stood there in the dark for a moment, holding the potato sack not moving. The earth had its own temperature. Down here, 6 feet below the surface, the ground did not know what the wind was doing. Did not know or did not care. It held its heat the way stone holds heat, slowly absorbed, slowly released, constant across the seasons. Below the frost line, below the reach of the wind and the bitter cycling of mountain air, there was a temperature that belonged to no particular season. It simply was. It had been there before the first frost of the previous autumn, and it would be there after the last frost of the coming spring, and it had nothing to do with what happened above the ground's surface. He had known this technically. Any man who had ever dug a root cellar knew it. But knowing a thing and truly understanding it were different, and Walt had spent 40 years building things for a living and somehow never applied this particular knowledge to its most obvious use. Walt climbed back out of the cellar and stood in the February cold with potatoes in one hand and an idea beginning to form in the other. If the ground stayed warm underground, why couldn't a man cook there? He spent the rest of February and all of March turning the idea over in his mind, the way you turn a piece of wood before you cut it, looking at the grain, checking for knots, thinking about where the saw should go. He did not talk about it. There was no one to talk to, and even if there had been, Walt was not the kind of man who talked about things before they were ready. He had learned early in his railroad years that half-formed ideas spoken aloud too soon had a way of dying in the speaking, losing their shape before they had fully found it. Eleanor had teased him about that, gently, in the way she had. Walt Greer could keep a secret from himself for 6 months before he'd admit he had one. He could hear her saying it, the specific pitch of her voice when she was amused. He could hear it more clearly than he expected to this far into the winter without her. By the first week of April, the idea was ready. He knew what he wanted to build. He knew roughly how to build it. He had spent 22 years working as a construction engineer for the Union Pacific Railroad before the Valley had called him west for the last time. And in those years, he had built things in conditions that made a Wyoming winter look polite. He had worked in Montana in temperatures that cracked iron bolts. He had designed drainage systems for mountain train depots and underground fuel storage chambers that had to stay above freezing, regardless of what the air outside decided to do. He had spent 2 winters in the Dakota Territory overseeing the construction of a rail yard that required its central heating system to be partially buried to protect it from wind exposure. He knew about thermal mass. He knew about heat transfer through stone. He knew about flue design and smoke travel and the way a properly built underground chamber could hold warmth for hours after the fire inside it had died. He knew about the difference between heat that was generated and heat that was stored, and he knew that stored heat in dense material was more reliable over time than generated heat in open air. He had simply never applied any of it to his own kitchen. The morning he drove the first stake into the ground behind the cabin, the sky was clear and the air was cold, but not bitter. April 3rd, he measured out 8 feet by 10 feet, tapped 4 wooden stakes into the corners, ran a string line between them to mark the edges, and began to dig. The earth was soft in the top 6 inches from the spring thaw, then firmer below that, then solid clay at about 2 feet. He worked steadily and without hurry. He did not need to rush this. He needed to do it right. Dale and Roy Bassett found him at it around mid-morning. They were brothers, both cattle ranchers who ran their herd on the western side of the valley. Dale at 57, Roy at 54. Both of them built like the animals they kept, broad and heavy-shouldered, with voices calibrated for open distances. They had the particular quality of men who have never been wrong about anything important, or at least have never admitted to it. They had ridden the ridge trail above Walt's property on their way to check on the upper fence line, and they had stopped their horses on the rise and looked down at the old man digging a hole in his own yard. They watched for a while without saying anything. Walt was aware of them. The valley carried sound easily in spring air, and he had heard the horses stop above him. He kept digging. The shovel bit into the soft earth, lifted a clean slice, and deposited it on the growing pile to the east of the marked-out pit. Another slice. Another. The rhythm of the work was its own answer to being watched. Finally, Dale cupped his hands around his mouth. Walt, what in the hell are you building down there? Walt paused, leaned on the shovel and looked up at the ridge. The brothers were silhouettes against the bright morning sky, their horses standing still and patient, the way horses do when their riders have stopped for reasons that have nothing to do with the horses. A kitchen, Walt said. There was a silence, not a short silence, the kind of silence that precedes a laugh so large it needs a moment to gather itself. Then Roy started laughing. Not the polite laugh of a man who isn't sure if something is funny, the full-bodied laugh of a man who has heard something that strikes him as genuinely completely absurd. His horse shifted sideways slightly at the sound of it. A kitchen, Roy repeated between breaths. In the ground. That's right, Walt said. Dale shook his head slowly. He had a way of shaking his head that communicated a whole paragraph of skepticism in a single motion, a slow, deliberate oscillation that suggested he had seen a great deal of the world's foolishness and was simply adding this to the catalog. Walt, the low ground floods every spring. You know that better than anyone. Walt pointed east with the shovel handle. Slope runs that direction. Water drains away from the house. Dale and Roy exchanged a look. Then Dale shrugged, the shrug of a man who has decided something is not worth arguing about, because the outcome will resolve itself soon enough. It's your ground, he said. They turned their horses and rode on toward the upper fence line, and the sound of Roy's laughter drifted back down the ridge for a full half-minute before it finally faded into the distance, and the valley went quiet again. Walt looked at the hole he had started. It was perhaps a foot deep and 8 feet long, and it was exactly the beginning of something. He put the shovel back in the earth. He kept digging. By the end of the first week, the pit was 3 feet deep, and the whole valley had heard about it. This was how frontier communities worked. They were not cruel by nature, most of them, but they were small and isolated and starved for anything interesting. And an old widower digging a kitchen into the ground behind his cabin was by any honest measure interesting. It combined the accessible appeal of apparent eccentricity with the more layered interest of a man doing something unfamiliar with evident purpose and skill. The story spread the way stories always spread in small valleys, one person to the next, slightly changed at each telling, until by the time it reached the general store at the edge of town, it had grown from Walt Greer is building an underground kitchen to Walt Greer has lost his mind since Eleanor passed. Walt heard the talk. He did not go out of his way to hear it, but the valley was small and sounds carried, and men who had known him for years sometimes forgot that he was standing nearby. He heard it at the feed store when he went for grain. He heard it from 2 women talking outside the dry goods store who stopped when they saw him and looked at him with the particular expression people wear when they have just been saying something about you and are hoping you are not close enough to hear it. He heard it from a child who asked him directly with the unguarded bluntness of someone who had not yet learned that some questions are not meant to be asked aloud. Mr. Greer, is it true you're building a stove in a hole? Walt had told the child. Yes, it was true, and the child had looked at him with frank interest and said, Why, boy? And Walt had said, because the ground is warmer than the wind, and the child had considered this seriously and nodded and walked away apparently satisfied, which was more than could be said for most of the adults who had heard the same explanation. He did not respond to any of the talk from the adults. There was a particular kind of dignity in that, in continuing to do the work without defending it, without explaining it to people who had already decided what they thought, without looking toward the ridge to see who was watching. Some men needed an audience for their ideas. Walt needed a shovel and enough daylight hours to use it. The work itself was the argument, and the work was not finished yet. Cornelius Aldridge Neal, to everyone in the valley, rode over on a Tuesday afternoon about 10 days after the digging started. Neal was 67 years old, the longest tenured homesteader in Harrow Creek Valley, aside from the Bassett brothers, and he had the particular quality of men who have seen enough of the world to be skeptical of new things without being hostile to them. He had homesteaded in this valley before the railroad came through, before the town of Harrow Creek had its general store, or its church, or its post office, when the valley was still the kind of place that attracted men who preferred distance between themselves and the nearest neighbor. He had watched the valley fill in around him and had adapted to it without either celebrating or resenting the change. He was, in Walt's estimation, among the most reliable people he had known in his life, not because he was always agreeable, but because his assessments of things were almost always accurate. He dismounted at the fence line and walked to the edge of the pit and looked down. The hole was now 4.5 feet deep. Walt was at the bottom of it, working on the north face where the clay was densest and the digging is slowest. "Planning to move in?" Neil asked. "Just cook," Walt said. Neil folded his arms across his chest. He had a beard gone entirely white and eyes the color of creek water in September gray-green, and steady the color of something that had been in one place long enough to settle. "Moke needs somewhere to go." Walt pointed to the trench he had begun digging outward from the far end of the pit. Flue runs underground first, stone-lined. Heat travels through it before the smoke reaches the chimney. Neil stared at the trench for a moment, reading its direction, calculating its angle. Underground flue. 22 feet of it. Stone absorbs the heat instead of letting it go straight up. "That's a lot of work," Neil said. Walt looked at the mountains above the valley, the high ridgelines still white with the snow that would not leave for another month. "So is hauling 2 cords of wood every winter." Neil was quiet for a moment. He had spent his own share of winters feeding a stove at 3 in the morning, watching good firewood turn into heat that vanished immediately into the frozen sky above. He had done the math himself privately and never spoken it aloud how much of a man's winter was spent simply maintaining warmth rather than living inside it. How much of a Wyoming winter was consumed not in doing things, but in sustaining the basic condition that made doing things possible. "The whole valley's going to talk," Neil said. "They already are," Walt said. Neil almost smiled. He looked at the pit again, at the measured corners, at the careful pile of removed earth to the east, at the way the trench angled precisely away from the house, with the deliberateness of someone who had thought about drainage and wind and slope before picking up a shovel. "You designed this yourself?" "I had some help," Walt said. Neil waited for more. Walt did not offer more. He picked up the shovel and drove it back into the clay face of the north wall. Neil watched him work for another minute. Then he walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode home down the valley road without another word. His horse's hoofbeats faded into the afternoon quiet, and Walt kept digging, and the valley kept turning toward evening, the way it always did, the shadows lengthening from the eastern slopes. First, the light going golden on the western ridgeline, the temperature dropping 5 degrees in the hour before dark. Neil came back the next morning with his own shovel. He arrived before Walt had finished his coffee. He tied his horse at the fence, walked to the pit, climbed down, and without a word began working on the section of east wall that Walt had not yet started. He did not ask if help was wanted. He simply began. Walt did not comment on this. He simply moved to the other end of the pit and kept digging. 2 old men in a hole in the Wyoming spring, working in parallel, doing the work without discussing why it was being done or why both of them were doing it. The shovels made their sounds in the earth. The birds made their sounds in the cottonwood trees. The morning moved along. That was friendship as Walt understood it, not the kind that required constant verbal confirmation of itself, the kind that showed up with a shovel. He found the notebook 3 weeks into the digging. He had not been looking for it. He had gone into the storage room at the back of the cabin to find a spare chisel he needed to score the flat stones he was pulling from the creek bed before fitting them against the clay walls. And his primary chisel had developed a small fracture at the tip that made it unreliable for precise work. He moved the old tool chest aside to reach the shelf behind it. The chest was heavy and shifted awkwardly, and when it moved, something slid off the top of it and fell to the floor with a flat, dry sound. A leather-bound notebook. Thin, worn at the corners, the leather darkened with age and handling tied shut with a piece of cord that had been retied recently enough that the knot was still tight. Walt picked it up. He recognized it immediately, the way you recognize the weight and shape of something you handled for years, even after years of not handling it. He had not seen it since sometime in the mid-1870s when he had put it away with the rest of his railroad equipment after his last Union Pacific job and come home to the valley for good. He had assumed it was packed away in the bottom of a trunk somewhere, or lost to one of the several moves they had made between railroad camps in the 1860s, or simply gone the quiet way of things that belong to a specific period of your life and have no obvious use in the period that follows. It was his own engineering notebook from his Union Pacific years. He had carried it in his coat pocket for the better part of a decade, filling it with measurements, design sketches, calculations for load and drainage and thermal resistance. The work of a man who built things for a living and needed to remember the specifics because in field conditions, memory was insufficient and paper was insurance. He untied the cord and opened it. The early pages were exactly as he remembered. Column specifications for a bridge footing in Nebraska, drainage angles for the depot platform at Cheyenne, a series of calculations for a snow load structure at a mountain crossing in Colorado. The precise functional handwriting of a man who had learned early that legibility in field conditions was not a nicety, but a necessity. Clear letters, clean numbers, nothing wasted. He turned the pages slowly. He was reading with the specific attention of a man who knows the contents of a document and is checking to confirm they are still there. He turned through the Nebraska pages, the Wyoming pages, the Montana depot work from the winter of 1868, when the temperature had stayed below -30 for 11 consecutive days, and they had kept working because the railroad kept its schedule regardless of what the thermometer decided. Then he found what he was looking for, though he had not known until this moment that he was looking for anything. Somewhere around page 40, his own handwriting stopped. Or rather, it continued but differently. The measurements were still there, the sketches still recognizable as engineering work, but in between his own notes and alongside them were other notes. Different handwriting. Smaller, more deliberate, the letters formed with the particular care of someone writing on a surface that moved or in light that was not quite enough, the care that comes from wanting to get something right rather than get it done quickly. Walt stood very still. He recognized that handwriting. He had been reading Eleanor's handwriting for 38 years. He had read it on the letters she had written him before they were married, when he was still on the railroad and she was still in Ohio, and the distance between them had been measured in weeks rather than miles. He had read it on the notes she left on the kitchen table when she went to town early, always telling him what she had left for his breakfast and what she needed from the store. And one other thing, always one other thing, sometimes practical and sometimes not. He had read it on the labels she put on her preserving jars, neat and specific, date and contents, and sometimes a small note about where the fruit had come from or what the weather was like when she put it up. He had read it on the single entry she made in the family Bible when her mother died, which was 3 sentences long and contained more grief in those 3 sentences than most people managed in 3 pages. He knew her handwriting the way he knew her voice, the way he knew the sound of her boots on the cabin floor in the morning, the particular cadence of her step, the way he knew which of her silences meant she was thinking and which meant she was troubled. He turned pages slowly now, reading what she had written. The notes were specific, technical, detailed in a way that told him she had not simply browsed his notebook, but had studied it, had thought carefully about what she was adding, had applied his designs to the particular conditions of their valley with the same systematic patience she brought to every practical problem she encountered. There were annotations about the soil composition at Harrow Creek, the depth at which the clay layer began the temperature differential she had apparently measured herself between the cabin floor and the root cellar floor on multiple dates across multiple winters, a small data set as careful as anything a trained engineer would have compiled. There were notes about the local creek stone, which type fractured too easily under repeated heating and cooling, which type held temperature well and resisted the stresses of thermal cycling. There were adjustments to his original flue design, small but precise accounting for the specific prevailing wind direction of their valley, which ran differently than the Montana conditions his original sketches had been designed for. Eleanor had been working on this, not recently. The ink was too faded for that, the pages too worn at the edges, the handwriting in the earlier annotations slightly steadier than in the later ones, a progression Walt recognized as the difference between a woman in her 50s and a woman in her early 60s, the subtle change that cold winters bring to hands that have been working hard for a long time. She had been doing this for years, quietly, without mentioning it, adding to his old notebook over the course of winters when he had been occupied with other things, storing her observations alongside his designs, building a record of something she understood he would eventually need. Walt sat down slowly on the storage room floor, the notebook in his hands. He turned to the last page she had written on. The annotation stopped, And then below them in handwriting slightly less steady than the earlier pages, the handwriting of a woman whose hands had begun to be troubled by the winter stiffness that had come on in her last several years. There was a single sentence. "You'll know when it's time, Walt." He sat with that sentence for a long time. The storage room was cold and quiet, and outside the valley birds were beginning their spring calls in the cottonwood trees. The same cottonwood trees under which Eleanor was now buried under the same sky she had spent 19 springs watching thaw back into green. The birds did not know she was gone. The creek did not know. The mountains above the valley continued their patient supervision of the seasons with complete indifference to the specific losses of the specific people who lived in the valley below them. Walt closed the notebook carefully and tied the cord back around it. He sat for another few minutes, not moving, not thinking in words, simply sitting with the weight of the notebook in his hands and the quality of the quiet in the storage room, and the knowledge that the person who had left this thing for him to find had known with the patient certainty of someone who paid close attention to people as well as to things that he would eventually be ready for it. Then he stood up, found his chisel, and went back to work. His son arrived on a Thursday, 3 days after Walt found the notebook. Walt was down in the pit when he heard the horse on the road. Over the weeks of working outdoors, he had developed the unconscious habit of identifying approaching sounds without looking up. It was an old skill from his railroad years, when situational awareness was a matter of safety, and it had returned easily in the quiet of the valley. The Bassett's horses were always faster and heavier, pushed hard out of habit. Neil's mare had a slight irregularity in her right foreleg that gave her a distinctive rhythm, a half-beat asymmetry, that was easy to identify once you had heard it a few times. The supply wagon from town announced itself with the particular rattle of a loose left wheel hub that had needed replacing for 2 years and would probably need it for 2 more. He did not recognize this horse. He climbed out of the pit and turned to find Emmett Greer dismounting at the fence gate. Emmett was 38 years old, broad through the shoulders, the way Walt had been broad at that age with Eleanor's dark eyes, and Walt's tendency to lead with his chin when he was preparing to say something he had thought carefully about and was going to say regardless of how it was received. He had been living in Denver for 4 years, working as a civil engineer for a company that built municipal water systems, reservoirs, distribution pipes, pump stations, the infrastructure that made cities livable. He was good at his work. Walt knew this not because Emmett had told him, which he had not in any detail, but because Walt knew how to read technical competence in the way the man talked about engineering problems, and Emmett talked about them well. Emmett tied his horse to the fence post with the particular care of a man who wants to delay a conversation slightly while he finishes organizing his thoughts. He walked across the yard, stopping to look at the pit before he reached the edge of it. He looked at the dimensions, the depth, the stone-lined walls on 2 of the 4 faces, the careful pile of removed earth to the east side. He looked at the trench running north from the far end of the pit with its precise angle and its beginnings of stone lining. He was doing what engineers do, reading the structure, understanding what it was before being told. Then he looked at his father. The expression on his face was the one Walt recognized from Emmett's childhood, the expression he made when he was trying to assess a situation before reacting to it, when he was deciding how much of what he knew to put on his face before he understood what was actually happening. It was an engineering expression in its way. Measure twice, speak once. "I heard from Neil Aldrich's nephew," Emmett said. "Said you were building something strange." "News travels," Walt said. "It was a letter, Pa. He wrote my office a letter." Emmett looked at the pit again, at the stone-lined walls, at the trench running north. His eyes moved the way an engineer's eyes move, not randomly, but along the lines of structure, following the logic of the design. "What is all this?" Walt explained it simply and clearly, the way he would have explained an engineering problem to a capable junior colleague. The thermal mass principle, the way dense material absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, creating a reservoir rather than a flow. The flue designed 22 feet of stone-lined underground passage that carried smoke from the stove before allowing it to rise through the chimney, giving the stone time to absorb the heat the smoke carried rather than letting that heat escape immediately into the sky. The way the surrounding earth then became a storage medium, not as hot as a stove, but steady, constant, working through the night and into the next day, unaffected by what the wind was doing 40 feet above. Emmett listened. He was his father's son in that he listened without interrupting, and he processed what he heard carefully before responding, turning it over the way Walt had turned the idea over in February and March, looking for the joints, checking the logic. "It could work," he said when Walt had finished. "I know it can work," Walt said. "I designed similar systems for Union Pacific depots in Montana in the 1860s. Those were large structures with professional construction teams and purpose-built materials. The principle is identical. Scale changes the execution. It doesn't change the physics. You're 63 years old and you're digging a hole in your backyard alone. Neil helps. Neil Aldridge is 67. Walt looked at his son steadily with the particular patience of a man who has been building things correctly since before the person questioning him was born. "I've been building things in hard conditions for over 20 years. I know what I'm doing." Emmett was quiet for a moment, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was choosing carefully among the things he could say. He had the look of a man who has prepared something and is deciding whether this is the right moment to deliver it. It was not the right moment. He had been in the valley less than an hour. He said it anyway because it was the reason he had come, and there was no point in delaying it. "Come back to Denver with me." Walt said nothing. "There's no reason to stay here alone. Not now. You could come down for the summer at least and see how it suits you. Eleanor's been gone since January, and you haven't left this valley since the funeral." "I'm not going to Denver," Walt said. Not harshly, just clearly. The way he closed the door, not slammed, simply shut fully, the latch engaged. The same tone he had used on construction sites when a decision had been made and the discussion was finished and there was work to be done. Emmett stood for a moment longer. Something moved across his face, not anger exactly, more the particular frustration of a man who has traveled a significant distance to say something important and has found the other person entirely unmovable on the subject. He nodded once slowly with the deliberateness of a man accepting a fact he does not prefer. He went back to his horse, checked the saddle cinch with his hands, though it did not need checking, and mounted with the practiced ease of someone who had been riding since childhood. Walt picked up his shovel and stepped back into the pit. He heard Emmett turn the horse toward the road. He heard the hoofbeats begin heading east toward town, toward the road that would eventually lead south to Denver. He did not look up. There was a section of clay wall on the north face of the pit that needed another course of stones before evening, and the light was good, and the earth was soft, and the work was exactly what it had always been, the thing that was there to be done. He had gone back to it for perhaps 10 minutes, working steadily on the north wall, when he heard the hoofbeats stop. He did not look up. He kept his eyes on the stone he was fitting, pressing it against the clay, checking its angle, finding its position in the wall. The valley was quiet. No wind today. The birds in the cottonwoods, the creek below the south pasture, the sound of his own breathing in the cool spring air. After a long pause, he heard the hoofbeats begin again, moving east, measured and steady, not rushing, fading down the valley road in the direction of Harrow Creek 12 miles away. Walt kept digging. Above him, the sky was the deep, particular blue of Wyoming in late April, a color you could not find in cities, a color that existed only where the air was thin and clean, and the horizon was made of mountains rather than buildings, a color that required distance to exist. Eleanor had loved that color. She had said once that it was the reason she had been willing to come west with him in the first place, back when the West was still something you chose rather than something you inherited. The sky here is a different blue, Walt, like the world is trying harder. The shovel hit a flat stone near the bottom of the pit, and Walt levered it up and set it aside. Good creek stone, dense and smooth, the kind that held heat well and did not fracture under temperature change. He had spent an afternoon at the creek bank earlier that week selecting stones carefully, the way Eleanor had selected fabric for a serious project, feeling the weight, checking the flatness, thinking about how it would sit against its neighbors and how it would behave under repeated heating and cooling over the course of many winters. He worked until the light started to soften toward evening. Then he climbed out of the pit, set down the shovel, and stood for a moment looking at the work. The pit was nearly 6 feet deep now. The walls on 3 sides were lined with the first course of creek stone set tightly against the clay, without mortar, each stone holding its neighbors and being held by them in return. The trench running north was 2 feet deep and 8 feet long, waiting for its own stone lining. The whole structure was beginning to reveal its shape, the underground chamber, the passage beneath the earth, the chimney that would eventually rise at the far end like the last visible element of something mostly hidden. Walt picked up Eleanor's notebook from the porch railing where he had set it that morning. He untied the cord and opened it to her last written page. He read her single sentence one more time. "You'll know when it's time, Walt." He looked at the pit, at the stone walls beginning to rise from the clay, at the Wyoming sky going gold above the mountains, the same sky that had looked down on every day of work he had done in this valley, the same sky that would look down on all the days of work still ahead of him. He closed the notebook and held it for a moment, not reading, just holding. "I know," he thought. "I'm a little late, but I know." He went inside to start supper. Behind the cabin, the pit waited in the quiet evening, 6 feet deep and less than half built, holding the fading warmth of the day's sunlight in its stone-lined walls patiently, without requiring anything of anyone. The way the ground below the frost line has always held whatever is placed in its care. Walt Greer was 63 years old, alone in the valley where he had built his life, working on the last thing Eleanor had left him to do. He was just getting started. Summer came to Harrow Creek Valley the way it always did, not as an arrival, but as a slow replacement. The cold did not leave. It was displaced. Inch by inch, week by week, the warmth pushed it back up the mountain slopes and into the high passes where it would wait, patient and certain for its turn to return. By the end of May, the valley grass had gone from brown to green, and the creek was running full and cold with snowmelt, and the cottonwood trees along the east pasture had leafed out fully, their new leaves the particular bright green of things that had been waiting a long time for light. They shaded the small wooden cross Walt had set into the ground near Eleanor's grave, and the grave itself was covered now with the same new grass as the rest of the field, and in the green of the spring pasture it looked less like a wound in the earth and more like a place where the ground had decided to be especially quiet. He visited the grave each morning before starting work. Not for long, 5 minutes, sometimes 10. He did not speak aloud. He was not that kind of man, and he suspected Eleanor would have found it unnecessary. She had always preferred actions to announcements, and she would have recognized his continued presence in the valley, his continued work on the things she had left in his hands, as communication enough. He simply stood there with his coffee and looked at the mountains above the tree line and allowed himself the particular quiet of a man who has accepted a loss without having finished grieving it, and who has learned that the two things, acceptance and grief, do not resolve each other, but can be carried simultaneously if you keep moving. Then he walked back to the pit and picked up his tools. The work had entered its second phase. The digging was largely done. The main chamber measured 8 feet by 10 feet and reached 6 feet below the surface, deep enough that the roof, when he built it, would sit at ground level and be invisible from any distance. The trench running north from the chamber's far end was complete, 22 feet long, 2 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, angled slightly upward toward the spot behind the cabin where the chimney pipe would eventually rise. The angle was Eleanor's, noted in the margin of page 41 of the notebook, a small correction to the original Montana design that accounted for the specific prevailing wind of Harrow Creek Valley, which came predominantly from the northwest rather than the west. Now came the stonework. Walt had spent 3 full days at the creek bed in early May selecting stones. This was not a casual operation. He needed flat stones dense enough to absorb and hold heat without fracturing under repeated thermal cycling, the expansion and contraction that happened every time the stove was lit and allowed to cool. Creek stone varied considerably in its properties. Some of it was sandstone, which looked solid, but carried heat poorly and cracked too easily when subjected to direct fire exposure. Some of it was the local gray granite, which was better but hard to work and difficult to fit cleanly. The best material was a dark, fine-grained stone that appeared in the deeper sections of the creek bed where the current ran strongest, and had sorted the heaviest material, heavy itself smooth, on its flat faces, almost glassy when wet, with a density that you could feel in the weight of it. Eleanor's notebook had noted this specific stone. The dark, flat stone from the deep bend south of the willow stand holds temperature better than anything else in the creek. Does not crack. I kept pieces through 2 winters in the root cellar and compared them. This stone is the right choice. She had measured this. She had tested it herself quietly in the practical way she tested everything, by observation over time with patience and recorded results. Walt did not know exactly how she had run her temperature tests in the root cellar, but the note was there in her careful handwriting, and it was correct. He knew it was correct because he recognized the stone she was describing and because his own engineering instincts confirmed what her observation had recorded. She had been right about the stone. She had been right about the flue angle. She had been right about the clay composition. She had been right about the frost depth in this particular section of the valley, which ran slightly deeper than the upper meadows, due to the shade pattern from the northern slope. He was beginning to understand that she had been right about most things, and that the two of them together had understood this valley better than either of them had understood alone, and that the notebook in the tool chest had been her way of combining what they knew into something neither of them could have built separately. Walt loaded 300 pounds of the Dark Creek stone into the wagon over the course of those 3 days, making 4 trips between the creek and the cabin. He stacked the stone near the pit entrance and covered it with canvas to keep it from freezing on cold nights. When Neil came by, which was most afternoons now, they would sometimes sit beside the stone pile, and Walt would turn pieces over in his hands, and Neil would ask questions about why this stone and not that one, and Walt would explain what he was looking for, and Neil would nod and sometimes say something useful and sometimes say nothing, and either way it was a good use of an afternoon. The stonework took the better part of June. Walt fitted each stone against its neighbors, the way a careful man lays a foundation, not by forcing pieces together, but by finding pieces that belonged together, that sat flush without mortar, that distributed weight evenly across the clay walls behind them, and transferred load cleanly to the stones below. He had built stone structures before on railroad work, and he understood that the key was not the mortar, but the selection and the fitting. Mortar was what you used when the stones were not right for each other. It was an apology for poor fitting, and it was always the first thing to fail when the structure was stressed. Stones fitted correctly held by their own geometry, and geometry did not crack. Neil Aldrich came by most afternoons. He did not always help with the stonework. His hands had been troubled by stiffness since the previous winter, the cold having done the slow accumulating damage that it does to the joints of men who have worked outdoors for 40 years, and the fine work of fitting small stones in precise positions was difficult for him in a way that his pride did not quite allow him to fully acknowledge their bone. But he sat on the ground above the pit and watched, and occasionally he handed tools down when Walt asked for them, and most usefully he simply kept Walt company in the wordless way that old men who have been friends for a long time can keep each other company without either of them having to perform the effort of conversation. He had a canvas chair he had started bringing after the first week of sitting on the bare ground, which Walt had not commented on, which Neil had not explained. Reverend Silas Pruitt came once in the middle of June riding past on his way to a homestead call at the far end of the valley. He stopped his horse at the fence line and looked at the work for a while without dismounting. Pruitt was 70 years old, a lean man with a narrow face and the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading people in the particular compressed setting of a small community, seeing everything, commenting selectively, understanding that the standing of one person in a community was always connected to the standing of others, and that the stories people told about each other shaped the community as surely as the structures they built. "How's it coming, Walt?" he asked. "Slowly," Walt said from inside the pit. "But right." Pruitt nodded. He looked at the stone lining on the walls, at the careful fitting, at the trench running north. "People in town are still talking." "I expect so. They're saying Eleanor's passing has affected your judgment." Walt set a stone carefully against the wall and checked its level with a small brass instrument he had carried since his railroad years. "People are welcome to their theories." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who said things carelessly, and he was deciding whether what he wanted to say next was the right thing or simply the true thing, and whether the difference mattered in this instance. "I don't think that myself. I've known you long enough to know the difference between grief and foolishness." "You're not being foolish." Walt looked up at him. "No," he said, "I'm not." Pruitt touched the brim of his hat in a small salute, the gesture of a man acknowledging something, without turning it into a speech, and rode on toward the end of the valley. Walt went back to the stonework. July was hot. Temperatures in Harrow Creek Valley climbed into the 90s on the worst afternoons, and most of the valley's cabins became nearly uninhabitable by midday. Cooking inside a one-room house in July heat meant standing over a wood stove in a room that had already reached the temperature of a bread oven, sweating into a meal that tasted of the effort it had cost. Most families ate cold food in midsummer or cooked early in the morning before the heat built fully, or did both and still endured the afternoon the way they endured everything in this valley by not complaining about it, which was not the same as not suffering from it. Walt cooked in the pit. The main chamber was not finished. He had not yet installed the permanent stove or completed the flue lining, but the stone walls and the surrounding earth kept the underground space at a temperature that seemed to belong to a different season entirely. Some days the valley above baked at 92 degrees. The cabin with its south-facing window and its low ceiling and its dark roof that absorbed every available unit of summer heat was worse than the valley. Inside the chamber, even without any fire, the temperature held steady near 55 degrees. The earth did not care about July. It was engaged in its own long-term project, storing what the summer gave it for the winter that would eventually come to claim it. He brought his camp stove down one afternoon just to test the principle with heat present, set it on the clay floor at the near end of the chamber, and cooked a simple meal of beans and salt pork. The heat from the small stove warmed the chamber quickly, but it did not become unbearable the way the cabin did. The stone walls absorbed the excess warmth rather than reflecting it back. The air stayed breathable, comfortable, warm enough to be pleasant, cool enough to stay in without misery. The kind of temperature that invited a man to remain in a place rather than driving him out of it. Walt sat on an upturned crate and ate his beans in the cool underground air, while the valley above him shimmered in the July heat, and he thought about how Eleanor would have received this particular moment. She would have laughed. Not mockingly, she was not capable of that kind of laughter, the kind that diminished rather than shared. But with genuine delight, the unreserved delight she brought to things that worked better than expected, to solutions that revealed themselves in action rather than in theory. She had the quality of finding real uncomplicated pleasure in the confirmation of a good idea, not as vindication, but as the simple satisfaction of something fitting together the way it was supposed to fit. He could almost hear her. "Well, Walt, you've done it again." He finished his beans and went back to work. The stove installation happened in early August. Walt had salvaged the stove from a mining camp equipment auction in late April, the same week he had started staking out the pit. It was a heavy iron box stove, older than he was, but built to last considerably longer, the kind of workmanship that came from an era before manufactured goods were expected to be replaced rather than maintained. Its firebox was large enough to hold substantial logs, its flat-top surface wide enough for two full-size pots simultaneously, and it had been maintained well by whoever had owned it last. Walt had paid $6 for it and considered that a reasonable price for something that would serve the underground kitchen for the next several decades. Getting it into the pit required a ramp built from timber planks and a block and tackle arrangement rigged from the shed roof beam. It took most of a day. Neil managed the rope while Walt guided the stove down the ramp, and at one point the whole assembly shifted sideways on the ramp as the stove's weight redistributed unexpectedly, and both of them had to hold it there for a long, breathless moment. Walt with his shoulder against the side of the stove, Neil with the rope double wrapped around both hands, while the physics worked through its considerations and came down on the side of not dropping it. But the stove reached the bottom of the ramp intact, and Walt set it in its prepared position at the far end of the chamber and bolted its legs to the stone floor he had built to receive it. The flue connection came next. The smoke would travel from the stove's back outlet through a short horizontal iron pipe, and then into the stone-lined underground trench. The trench, the 22 feet of underground passage that Walt had spent the better part of 2 weeks building, with particular care fitting stones tightly around the inner surface to create a smooth channel for the smoke to travel, ran the full length of its prepared path before reaching the vertical chimney pipe that rose behind the cabin. 22 feet of stone-lined underground passage, each foot of it absorbing heat from the slow-moving smoke, transferring that heat into the surrounding earth, and delivering the cooled smoke to the chimney only after the majority of its heat had been extracted. The principle was not complicated. That was the point. A system that required specialized materials, precise machinery, or technical knowledge, available only in cities, would not survive in an isolated mountain valley. This system required stone-clay iron and an understanding of a principle that the earth had been demonstrating to every man who had ever dug a root cellar, the principle that below the frost line, the ground held a temperature that the wind in the sky could not reach. Walt sealed the final joints between the iron pipe and the stone passage with a clay compound he had prepared himself, the formula from his railroad years adjusted slightly, based on a note Eleanor had written about the specific mineral composition of the local clay, which she had apparently tested for workability and adhesion over several winters, keeping notes she had never mentioned to anyone. He stood back and looked at the completed installation. The stove sat in its place. The flue connection was secure. The stone passage ran its full length beneath the clay floor. The chimney pipe rose correctly at its far end, positioned and angled to draw cleanly. Everything was where it needed to be. He lit the first fire on a Thursday evening in late August. Neil was there. He had arrived uninvited an hour before, which was his custom when he knew something significant was about to happen. Walt had never found a way to ask him how he always seemed to know it was one of those qualities in Neil that had no obvious explanation, like the way he always showed up at the right time and never at the wrong one. Walt had long since stopped noticing the presumption of it because the presence itself was always the right thing. Walt loaded the stove with dry pine split, fine, well-seasoned, through the summer, the kind of wood that caught immediately and burned clean. He struck a match. The tinder caught. The kindling caught. The larger pieces caught. Within 2 minutes, the stove was burning steadily, its iron sides beginning to tick and expand as the metal warmed for the first time in its new position. Walt and Neil stood in the chamber and waited. The smoke moved the way it was supposed to move, drawn by the draft into the horizontal flue pulled by the chimney's draw, through the stone-lined passage rising through the vertical pipe and exiting above ground behind the cabin. Walt climbed the ladder once to check the chimney outlet. The smoke was coming out cleanly and steadily, the right color, no sign of backflow or obstruction. He climbed back down. They waited longer. After perhaps 20 minutes, Neil walked to the north wall of the chamber and placed both his palms flat against the stone surface. He held them there for a long moment. His eyes were focused on something that was not in the room, the internal attention of a man running a calculation. Then he moved to the floor and crouched and pressed one hand against the clay, holding it there. He stayed crouched for a while. Then he straightened slowly with the care a man of 67 takes when rising from a crouch, the deliberate unfolding the brief pause to check that everything has arrived back at its proper position. He looked at Walt. "The floor is warm," he said. "Yes," Walt said. "The wall too." "Yes." Neil looked at the stove, then at the floor, then at the wall. He was running the path of the heat. Walt could see it, the same quiet internal arithmetic he had watched engineers do for 20 years on railroad construction, following the energy from source to destination and accounting for what happened to it at each stage of the journey. "The smoke carries the heat through the stone," Neil said slowly, "and the stone transfers it into the ground." "That's right, and the ground holds it, long after the fire dies. Hours sometimes, depending on how much you've put into the system over time." Neil pressed his hand against the wall again, and then he looked at Walt with an expression Walt had not seen on his face before, not the skepticism Neil brought to new things, not the polite, neutral interest he wore when assessing something he wasn't sure about, but something more direct than all of those. The expression of a man who has tested something and found it to be exactly what it claimed to be. "I'll be damned, Walt," he said quietly. "It actually works." Walt nodded once. "I know." They stood there for several more minutes, neither of them saying anything, feeling the warmth come up from the floor and out from the stone walls, while the pine burned steadily in the stove and the August evening moved toward full dark above them. And somewhere on the western ridge, a coyote said something to the valley, and the valley did not answer. It was the best Walt had felt since January. The news of the successful test reached the valley's general store within 48 hours. Walt had told no one except Neil. Neil had told his nephew. His nephew had mentioned it to someone at the feed store. By the following Sunday after Reverend Pruitt's service, it was common knowledge in Harrow Creek that Walt Greer's underground kitchen had passed its first fire test, and that the whole strange enterprise had not immediately resulted in smoke inhalation flooding structural collapse or any of the other outcomes the valley had been quietly anticipating. This shifted the tone of the valley's opinion slightly from outright ridicule to the particular skepticism that replaces ridicule when the thing being ridiculed stubbornly refuses to fail. People did not admit they had been wrong. People rarely did in Walt's experience, and he did not expect it or require it from them. But the quality of their comments changed. That widower's lost his mind became, well, it might work for summer cooking, but wait until winter comes. which was, as far as Walt was concerned, a reasonable position. Winter was the real test. He had always known that. What he had not anticipated was Roy Bassett. Walt found out about it from Neil on a Wednesday morning in early September. He had been at the creek selecting additional stones for a secondary layer on the chamber floor. The original layer was performing well, but he wanted more thermal mass in that specific section when Neil rode up and dismounted with the slightly careful manner of a man who is about to say something he would rather not have to say. "I've got something to tell you," Neil said, "and you're not going to like it." Walt set down the stone he was holding and waited. Roy Bassett, it turned out, had spent the previous 3 weeks having his hired man build a version of the underground kitchen at his own property. He had done this without consulting Walt, without asking for plans, working entirely from a rough description assembled from second-hand accounts of how the system was supposed to function. The hired man had dug the chamber in the trench, installed Roy's old kitchen stove, and connected it to a chimney pipe, all in the correct general sequence, and none of it in the correct specific detail. The flue trench had been dug running in the wrong direction relative to the prevailing wind, creating a draft problem from the beginning. The stone lining was loosely fitted, full of gaps that allowed smoke to escape sideways into the surrounding earth, rather than traveling cleanly through the channel. The chimney pipe had been installed too short, creating insufficient draw. The result was a chamber that filled with accumulated carbon monoxide every time the stove was lit, slowly and visibly, exactly as any poorly ventilated enclosed space would. On a Tuesday afternoon, Roy's hired man had gone into the chamber to light the stove and had been found an hour later slumped against the far wall, barely conscious, the air in the chamber no longer safe to breathe. The man survived. He was taken to town and recovered fully within 2 days. Roy Bassett had acted quickly and correctly once the situation was understood, and Walt did not doubt the genuine alarm Roy had felt. But by the time the story moved through the valley, certain details had been smoothed away and others had been amplified, the way stories always are in small communities. And what most people heard was not Roy Bassett built a faulty copy without understanding the design and nearly poisoned his hired man, but rather Walt Greer's underground kitchen idea nearly killed Roy Bassett's hired man. The distinction was significant. The version that spread was not the significant one. Walt stood at the creek bank and listened to Neil tell it, and he said nothing for a long time after Neil finished. The mountains above the valley were clear in the September light. The creek moved past his boots, cold and completely indifferent, carrying its small cargo of fallen leaves downstream toward the lower valley, the way it carried everything that fell into it, without preference, without urgency, simply in the direction it had always gone. Somewhere above the ridge, a pair of hawks were working a thermal rising in slow, patient circles, without any visible effort, the way things with the right design can rise. "People are saying you should stop," Neil said quietly. "Pruitt told me some of the men at the store think you ought to fill in the chamber before winter, before someone else tries to copy it and gets hurt." Walt was quiet another moment. He was not constructing an argument. He was simply being accurate. "Roy built it wrong," he said. "I know that. He didn't ask. He didn't look at the plans. He built it from a rumor about how it worked. I know that too. The system works correctly when it's built correctly. That is not a separate issue." "Walt," Neil's voice was steady without edge, "I know, but I'm not the one you need to convince." Walt looked at the hawks riding the thermal above the ridge. They had risen high enough now that they were barely visible against the September blue, patient, unhurried. Riding something the people below them could not see, but that was real and reliable, and had been there for as long as the air had been moving over the mountains. "I can't convince people with words," he said. "I never could. The only thing that will answer this is winter." Neil looked at him steadily for a moment. Then he nodded. "Then you'd better make sure the system is ready for it," he said. Walt picked up the stone he had set down and turned it in his hands. Dense, flat, the dark, fine-grained stone from the deep bend south of the willow stand. "It will be," he said. October arrived in Wyoming the way it always arrived, not gradually but suddenly, like a door opening in the north. One week the days were still warm enough at noon to work in shirt sleeves, and then a wind came down from the high peaks and the temperature dropped 20 degrees between morning and afternoon, and the frost appeared on the valley grass the next morning and did not melt back. The first snow showed on the high peaks within days, and the elk moved down out of the timber and onto the lower slopes, and every homesteader in Harrow Creek Valley turned their full attention from the year's last outdoor work to the year's first serious winter preparation. Stack the wood, seal the walls, check the roof, count the stores. Walt was doing all of this with one additional task occupying his evenings. He had been firing the underground stove daily since the August test, running it for 2 or 3 hours each evening, monitoring how the system performed under repeated use. The smoke traveled cleanly. The stone flue absorbed heat efficiently. The chamber held warmth well into the following morning, after each evening fire, still measurably warm at the floor when he pressed his palm to it the next day. Everything was functioning exactly as intended. He found the crack on the 14th of October. He had gone into the chamber after the evening fire to check the floor temperature. He had established the habit of pressing his palm to the same spot near the center of the floor each time, building a rough but consistent record of heat retention across the weeks. The floor should have been uniformly warm across its full surface. Instead, there was a band running diagonally across the section over the first 8 feet of the flue trench, perhaps 3 inches wide, noticeably cooler than the surrounding floor, as if something beneath it was not participating in the system's warmth. Walt crouched. He ran his fingers along the surface, pressing here and there, following the cold band. He got up and went to the tool wall and came back with a thin metal probe rod and worked it carefully along the line of the anomaly. At one point, it dropped into a gap, then another, 6 inches further, then a third at a slightly different angle. He sat back on his heels. He understood what had happened. In the section of flue trench closest to the stove where the thermal cycling was most intense, the daily heating to high temperatures followed by cooling, overnight the repeated expansion and contraction had worked on a hairline fracture in one of the load-bearing stones in the channel wall. The fracture had propagated slowly across 6 weeks of testing until it had disrupted the stone alignment sufficiently to create gaps. The flue was now losing heat sideways into the lower clay rather than retaining it in the channel. The structural integrity of that section was compromised. Under sustained high-temperature firing, the kind required to carry warmth through a serious winter storm, the section could fail entirely. Walt sat in the chamber for a long time. The stove beside him was burning down to coals. The warmth in the chamber was real and working, and everything he had built it to be, and all of it depended on a section of stone 6 feet below the floor that had decided in October to crack in ways he had not predicted. He calculated what the repair required. Break up the floor section over the compromised area 5 feet, possibly 6. Remove the failed stones from the channel. Refit the section with correctly selected replacement stones. Relay the floor above. Work he had done before in better conditions. But the ground was cold now, the clay beginning to stiffen at the edges of the excavation, and the first serious storm could arrive any time after November 1st. He had perhaps 2 weeks before the window closed. Walt sat there until the stove went cold. The chamber temperature dropped slowly, the stone walls releasing what they had stored over the course of the evening, warming the air long after the fire was gone. Even partially failing, the system did what it was supposed to do. He stood up. He went back inside and got his tools and started work. He did not tell Neil. He did not tell anyone. This was not deception. It was something more fundamental, the recognition that a problem partially understood and communicated becomes someone else's problem before it is fully solved. The carbon monoxide incident had already deposited a valley full of people with strong opinions about his underground kitchen. Adding "and now the floor section is failing" to that conversation would not help him fix it and might well end it permanently. He would fix it first, then it would be fixed and the conversation would have no reason to happen. He worked at night. He began after dark each evening when the lights in the distant cabins were the only evidence of other people in the valley, and he worked until 2 or 3 in the morning, and then he covered the open excavation with timber planks and went inside and slept 5 hours and got up and did the day's ordinary work. He split firewood. He checked the livestock. He maintained the cabin and the fences. He said nothing to anyone about what was happening underground after dark. The first night he broke up the compromised floor section. Removing stones he had laid himself, had selected and fitted carefully, accepting that careful work could be undone by conditions not fully predicted at the time of building. There was a specific kind of discouragement in that, not failure exactly. More the acknowledgement that even correct work operated in a world that had its own conditions and its own schedule. He sat alone in the cold chamber at midnight with a chisel in his hand and he let the full weight of it settle. He was 63 years old. It was October in Wyoming. He had been working this ground since April, and his hands ached from the cold, and his knees from the sustained crouching, and the project had been damaged, in the valley's opinion, by someone else's carelessness. And he was doing emergency repair work alone in secret, and somewhere in a hotel 12 miles away. Emmett was not quite gone, not waiting for him to fail. Walt understood, but not entirely sure he would not. And Eleanor was in the ground under the cottonwood tree, and the wind outside the cabin above him had the edge in it that meant serious winter was assembling itself somewhere to the north and west. He sat with all of that for exactly as long as it took to understand it clearly. Then he picked up the chisel and kept working. On the third night at midnight, he heard footsteps on the ground above the chamber. He stopped. The footsteps paused at the entrance directly above. Then he heard the wooden door creak open and the sound of someone on the ladder, and he turned to find Neil Aldrich at the bottom rung with a lantern in one hand. The two men looked at each other. Neil's face in the lantern light was the face Walt had known for 15 years. The gray creek eyes, the white beard, the expression that had never once in all that time wasted itself on things that did not need to be said. He looked at the broken-up floor section. He looked at the removed stones stacked against the east wall. He looked at the exposed flue channel with its failed stones still partly in position. He understood the situation completely, the way an experienced man understands physical situations given sufficient evidence. His eyes moved across the chamber the same way Walt's had moved across the creek bank when assessing stone methodically without hurry, following the logic of what was there. "Saw your light," he said. 3 nights running." Walt said nothing. "Figured you needed a second pair of hands." He hung the lantern on the hook Walt had installed near the entrance, and he crouched beside the exposed flue section and picked up one of the replacement stones Walt had selected and turned it in his hands, checking the faces, testing the weight, reading the stone. "Which end are you fitting first?" "South end, working back toward the stove connection." Neil nodded. He set the stone in the channel position and looked at how it sat against its neighbor. He made a small adjustment, pressing one corner down slightly with his palm, and looked again. "That one fits," he said. "It does," Walt agreed. They worked together in the lamplight without discussing anything beyond the immediate decisions of the stonework, which stone, which position, which end of the new section to fit next. The older men in Walt's experience had always been better at this than younger ones, better at understanding that the presence of the work was its own conversation, that hands doing useful things in the dark hours of a difficult night were their own form of expression, that a problem solved at 3 in the morning with a friend who showed up uninvited was a problem that would be remembered not for what it had threatened, but for how it had been handled. They worked until nearly 4 in the morning. The new section went in solidly, the stones fitted cleanly, the flue channel restored to its full structural integrity. Walt relayed the floor stones over the top and pressed each one down firmly, testing the surface as he went, confirming the even distribution of contact. He pressed his palm to the floor in his regular testing spot. "We'll need to fire it tomorrow evening to confirm the heat distribution corrects," he said. "I'll be here," Neil said. Walt looked at the restored floor, at the lamplight on the stone walls, at the old man sitting on his heels across from him with clay on both hands, and no particular interest in acknowledgement or gratitude, a man who had shown up in the dark because the light was on, and that was sufficient reason. "Neil," he said. "Don't," Neil said without looking up. Walt nodded. They climbed out of the chamber into a night that was cold and clear and entirely silent. The valley a white and gray geometry under a sky full of stars. The mountains stood against the darkness the way they always stood. The chimney pipe behind the cabin rose from the frozen ground at its slight angle, patient and ready. November was coming, the gale was coming with it. And underground in the stone and clay, in warm dark earth below Walter Greer's Wyoming homestead, 22 feet of carefully fitted stone passage lay ready, repaired, tested, built correctly, built to last, waiting for the moment when the rest of the valley would finally understand what one man had been building all summer long. The warning came on a Friday. A rider out of the northern pass stopped at Harrow Creek's general store just after noon on the second day of November 1889. His name was not known to most of the valley's residents, a contract courier who ran mail between the mountain settlements. When the weather permitted, a lean man on a hard-ridden horse with the look of someone who had been moving fast for a long time. But his news was known to everyone in the valley before the sun went down. Big storm building west of the division. Snow already falling hard across the high country. Wind out of the northwest, which in Wyoming meant the storm was not skirting the valley, but aimed directly into it, the kind of trajectory that meant days, not hours. By evening, the sky above Harrow Creek had taken on the particular quality that experienced mountain men recognized immediately and did not discuss, not dark exactly, but dense, a sky with weight to it, the kind of sky that did not threaten so much as inform. This is what is coming. Make your decisions accordingly. Walt stood on the cabin porch after supper and looked at that sky for a long time. He had made his decisions accordingly, and he had made them weeks ago. The firewood was stacked under the lean-to, protected by a canvas cover weighted at the corners with stones. The livestock were in the barn with extra hay and a full water tank. The cabin walls had been rechinked in September, every gap pressed with fresh clay compound and allowed to cure in the October warmth. The underground chamber had been fired daily for 2 weeks, its stone walls and clay floor carrying accumulated warmth that had built layer upon layer like interest, compounding each fire, adding to what the previous fire had left the earth, storing it all with the patient efficiency that stone and clay had been demonstrating for as long as the earth had existed. Walt had spent those 2 weeks doing one additional thing that he had not discussed with Neil and had not mentioned to anyone. He had been extending the duration of each firing, 2 hours the first week, then 3, then 4. Not because the temperature outside required it yet, but because he understood something about thermal mass that the people who were eventually going to need this system did not. Heat stored in earth and stone did not behave like heat stored in a firebox. A firebox was a transaction. You put wood in, you got heat out, you stopped putting wood in, and the heat was gone within hours. Earth that had been warmed gradually over days and weeks held that warmth differently. It was not a transaction, but an accumulation, a slow building of temperature in a material that changed its state slowly and released it slowly. The longer and more consistently you built it, the longer it lasted after you stopped feeding it. The chamber was as ready as anything he had ever built. Walt went inside and banked the cabin stove and went to bed. The storm arrived before dawn. He woke to the sound of it, not the gradual building of an ordinary winter wind, but the full committed arrival of something that had crossed a mountain range and come down the other side with nothing left to slow it. The wind came first, a sustained roar that pressed against the cabin walls with a physical insistence. Then the snow came with the wind, not falling but driven horizontal and dense, striking the windows like something thrown. The cabin walls flexed slightly under the pressure of the first serious gusts, a flex Walt had felt before in bad winters, but never this pronounced, as if the storm were testing the structure for weaknesses. Walt dressed in the dark and stood at the window. The yard was already gone. Not obscured, gone. The fence line that ran 8 feet from the porch had disappeared completely beneath the driven white. The lean-to where the firewood was stacked was a shape without edges. The cottonwood trees at the edge of the east pasture had vanished entirely, which meant Eleanor's grave was invisible too, swallowed into the uniform white of the valley, and for a reason he could not have clearly articulated. It was not logical. She was not cold, she was beyond all cold. This made the morning feel lonelier than it otherwise would have. He lit the cabin stove, put water on, and sat at the table with Eleanor's notebook open in front of him. He had been reading it every morning since October. Not always the technical sections, those he had memorized by the end of summer, but the earlier pages, the ones he had not initially noticed when he first found the notebook, where Eleanor's annotations were less about engineering and more about the valley itself. Small observations recorded over years. The way the creek froze from the edges inward and what that rate indicated about the frost depth that year. The difference in sound between the pines on the south slope and the north slope when the wind moved through them, and what that difference suggested about the wind's angle of approach. The way the elk moved before a major storm, which direction, how far down from the timber, how many days before the snow arrived. She had been paying attention to this valley for 19 years. The same 19 years he had been building structures and maintaining fences and hauling wood and doing all the things that kept them alive and in place here. They had been paying attention to different things. Both kinds of attention had been necessary. But hers had been quieter, less visible, and he had not understood until now, sitting in the cabin, while the storm she had predicted in her way bore down on the valley. She had studied how complete her understanding of this place had actually been. He closed the notebook gently and looked at the white opacity pressing against the window. Another winter Eleanor, he thought. A little different this time. He drank his coffee. Then he put on his heaviest coat, his wool scarf, his heaviest boots, and went out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical structure. Not a sensation, but an object. Something he walked into something with mass and intention, and a complete indifference to his plans for the morning. He had experienced Wyoming winters for 19 years and had never entirely adapted to the specific quality of serious mountain cold, the way it stopped being a temperature reading and became a presence, something that occupied the space around you and removed options you had not known you were depending on. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read -18. By afternoon, if the storm held its course in depth, it would be considerably lower. He made his way to the barn through drifts that were already knee-deep in the yard, checked the animals' added hay, broke the ice that had formed on the water tank overnight. The animals were calm. They had been through Wyoming winters before. They understood what was required of them, which was primarily to stay in the barn. Then he crossed the yard to the entrance of the underground chamber. The wooden door was buried to its top hinge. Walt dug it clear with the short-handled shovel he kept beside the entrance. For exactly this purpose, a shovel stored under a small covered bracket he had built into the wall above the door. He had anticipated that every significant storm would bury the entrance, and he had built the angled roof above the door frame to reduce the drift accumulation. But in a storm of this magnitude, the roof could only slow the process. He dug efficiently and without hurry cleared the door and pulled it open. Warm air came up from the chamber below. Not the aggressive heat of a newly stoked stove, something older and quieter than that. The warmth that had been building in the stone walls and clay floor for weeks of preparation, the warmth of the earth itself expressing what it had been storing. The chamber temperature held near 60 degrees. Outside was -18. The differential between them was 78 degrees, maintained entirely by accumulated thermal mass, and a modest fire Walt now built in the stove, small, efficient, just enough new heat to sustain and supplement what was already there. Far less wood than the cabin stove would consume fighting the same storm. He set a pot of water on the stove and sat on the upturned crate and listened to the storm above him. From inside the chamber, the storm was almost abstract. He could feel it in the faint vibration of the ground above, in the slight variation in the chimney draw as the wind gusted. But the sound was muffled, and the cold was entirely absent, and the warmth was entirely present and continuous, the warmth of stone and clay that had been absorbing heat for weeks and was now releasing it with the slow, unhurried reliability that was the Earth's essential quality. He was 6 feet underground in Wyoming in a November blizzard, and he was warm. He had built this warmth himself, stone by stone, from April through November, and it was working exactly as it was supposed to work. Walt made his breakfast. He ate it slowly, without hurry. Then he went back to the cabin to spend the first day of the storm the way all serious preparation eventually requires you to spend it, waiting. The storm lasted 3 days. During those 3 days, Harrow Creek Valley ceased to exist as a community and became a collection of isolated points of light. Cabin windows visible occasionally through brief lulls in the driving snow, each one its own small emergency, each family maintaining its own relationship with the cold and the berry wood in the stove that could not be allowed to go out regardless of how little fuel remained or how wet that fuel had become. Walt visited the underground chamber 4 times a day. He fired the stove each morning for 2 hours, checked the system at midday, added small fuel in the afternoon, and made his supper underground each evening before returning to the cabin to sleep. He used a fraction of the wood a conventional stove operation would have required for comparable warmth. The chamber temperature never dropped below 55 degrees, even on the second night when the thermometer outside fell to -40, and the creek froze solid in less than 1 hour, a thing Walt had never seen in 19 winters in the valley. The creek freezing completely in an hour, the sound of it sharp and final in the middle of a night that was otherwise beyond sound. On the third morning, the wind stopped. It did not slow gradually. It stopped the way it sometimes did in Wyoming, as if a decision had been made somewhere above the clouds, the source simply cut off. The silence that replaced it was the most complete silence Walt had experienced in 3 days, and it was startling in the way that silence after prolonged noise is always startling. Not quiet, but the absence of violence, the absence of pressure, the sudden presence of what had been there before the storm arrived. Walt stood on the porch and looked at what the storm had made of the valley. The landscape was completely reorganized. Drifts of 5 and 6 feet had erased the familiar geography, fence lines gone the road indistinguishable from the fields on either side of it, the shapes of buildings reduced and transformed by their accumulated white. The lean-to had held, the barn had held, the cabin had held, but the world outside was a different world than the one that had existed 3 days ago, quieter and whiter, and stripped of the details that made it recognizable as the specific place it was. The thermometer read -38. In the stillness following the storm, that cold was different from the cold during it, not driven and dynamic, but settled, distributed evenly across the valley's surface, sitting on everything with the patient weight of something that had arrived and intended to remain. This was the kind of cold that did not announce itself. It simply maintained its position and waited for you to underestimate it. Walt was studying the field to the south when he saw movement at the far end of it, a figure on foot pushing through drifts that reached its waist in several places. Coming from the direction of the Western Valley, the Bassett Range, which was a mile and a half across open ground under ordinary conditions. Under these conditions, it was something different, something that required a reason. The figure moved steadily without stopping. It had no horse. It carried a shovel across one shoulder, more for balance than for any other purpose. Its coat had gone entirely white with adhered snow. It moved with the forward-leaning determination of a man who has committed to reaching a destination and has removed from consideration the possibility of not reaching it. Walt recognized the walk before he recognized the face, the particular forward lean of a man who has spent his life working into resistance. Dale Bassett had always walked that way, weight ahead of center chin, slightly forward, as if the next 10 feet were something to be pushed through rather than walked into. Walt had known Dale Bassett for 15 years, and in 15 years, that walk had not changed. Walt went inside and put more water on the stove. Dale reached the porch 20 minutes after Walt first spotted him. He was breathing in the hard, deliberate way of a man who has been doing something extremely difficult for a sustained period and is not going to stop until it is finished. Not the labored breathing of a man failing, the controlled breathing of a man managing. The snow on his coat had accumulated in layers and his beard was frosted solid, and his hands inside his heavy work gloves had a stiffness that went beyond cold stiffness. Walt recognized that stiffness. He had seen it before on men who had spent the night fighting a stove that was losing against the cold, who had been burning half-frozen wood for 10 hours and watching the cabin temperature drop, regardless who had arrived at a morning that felt like a reckoning. Dale Bassett stood at the bottom of the porch steps. He did not look up immediately. He stood with the shovel balanced across his shoulder and the frosted beard in the accumulation of 3 days of storm on his coat, breathing hard, and he did not speak and he did not look up. It was the posture of a man who has something to ask for and is taking a moment to make peace with the asking. Walt opened the door. He did not ask what had happened. He did not ask why Dale was there or what it had taken to walk a mile and a half through -38-degree cold to reach this particular porch. He opened the door the way you open a door for a man who has traveled that distance in those conditions to reach you completely immediately without any conditions attached to the opening. Dale came inside. Walt handed him a cup of hot water. The coffee was not ready yet, and Dale held it in both hands and said nothing for a full 2 minutes, just breathing and letting the cabin warmth begin its work on the frost in his beard and the cold in his hands. From the back corner of the cabin, someone moved. Dale looked up. Emmett Greer was sitting at the small table near the back wall, his own cup in his hands, watching Dale with the steady attention of a man who has been waiting for something and is now watching it arrive. He had come to the valley 2 days before the storm, not to the cabin initially, but to the town of Harrow Creek, 12 miles east, and then on the first day the storm's approach became visible in the sky, he had ridden out and reached his father's cabin by mid-afternoon, not announcing himself, tying his horse in the barn, and walking into the cabin and sitting down with the quiet, slightly embarrassed directness of a man who has changed his mind about something and does not want to make a ceremony of the change. He had been in Wyoming since then, first not quite gone, and then simply here, which was a different thing. Walt had not said anything when Emmett walked in that day. He had handed him a cup and gone back to checking the livestock, and Emmett had sat at the table and drunk his coffee, and that had been all that was necessary. Now Emmett looked at Dale Bassett, and Dale looked at Emmett, and a great deal passed between them that required no words. The specific recognition of two men who both understood something about underestimating the man who stood between them, and who found themselves on the other side of that understanding in the same room. "Your woodpile," Walt asked. Dale set the hot water cup on the table. "Froze solid, all of it. Roy's place, too. We worked at it for 2 days. He paused. "Cabin was at 40 degrees inside by last night. Couldn't get the temperature to hold." Walt nodded. He had thought about this, had understood it as a likely consequence of the storm's duration and the valley's preparation patterns. Half-frozen wood burned at a fraction of its capacity, spending most of its heat melting the ice inside the log before producing any useful warmth for the room. In sustained extreme cold, the math turned against you quickly and kept going in the wrong direction. More wood for less heat, the supply depleting faster than usual, the temperature dropping regardless. "Come out back," Walt said. He opened the underground chamber door, and the warm air came up in a slow, visible exhalation. A faint mist in the cold above the entrance, the breath of the earth escaping into weather it did not share. Dale stood at the top of the ladder. He did not move for a moment. He stood at the top and looked down into the warmth the way a man looks at something he has been told about for months, but has not until this moment believed. Walt had seen this expression before on Neil, the evening of the August fire test, who had pressed both palms against the warm wall and said nothing for a long time. He had seen it on Emmett, who had come down on the second day of the storm and stood in the chamber for a full 10 minutes, pressing his hands against the walls and doing the engineering calculation in his head with the expression of someone recognizing something true that they had been told was probably not true. Dale descended the ladder. He stood in the chamber and felt the warmth on his face. He looked at the stone walls and the clay floor and the iron stove burning its small, efficient fire in the corner. He looked at the flue pipe disappearing into the stone channel beneath the floor. He placed one hand against the wall and held it there. Then he crouched and touched the floor. The warmth was in both. Not the fierce heat of a stove, the steady warmth of stored heat in dense material, the warmth that had been building for weeks and would go on for days more. Dale was quiet for a long time. Walt said nothing. He had learned over this long year that the system explained itself to anyone who stood inside it with an open mind. The warmth was the argument, the stone walls were the evidence. The 60-degree temperature in the middle of a minus 38-degree morning was the conclusion. "How long has it been this warm?" Dale asked finally. "Since before the storm hit. The ground stored the heat over weeks. The storm doesn't change what's down here." Dale looked at the ceiling, the timber beams with packed earth above them, the surface of the yard, the world of the storm separated from this warmth by 6 feet of Wyoming clay and stone, and the simple fact that the earth below the frost line does not negotiate with the weather above it. "Roy nearly lost 2 calves last night," Dale said. "Barn heater gave out." "Bring them here if you need to," Walt said. "There's room in the barn." Dale looked at him. Walt said it the way he had opened the door, without conditions, without ceremony, without any signal that it needed to be noted or remembered or eventually repaid. He said it the way you say a simple true thing when a simple true thing is the right response. Dale nodded once slowly. Emmett had come down the ladder behind them and stood near the entrance, present the way he had been present for the past several days, not taking space, but occupying it in the particular way of someone who belongs somewhere and has recently rediscovered that fact. Walt looked at his son. Emmett met his eyes. Something passed between them that was not a conversation and not a reconciliation. Those words were too formal for what it actually was. Something quieter than either of those. The understanding that two people reach when they have been paying attention to the same thing from different angles and have found at last the angle they share. Walt turned back to the stove and built the fire up slightly and put the coffee pot on, and the three of them sat in the underground warmth while the Wyoming cold sat on the valley above them, and the stone walls held their heat, and the earth did what it had always done. By the afternoon of that first day after the storm, 3 more men had come. Neil Aldridge arrived before noon. He had dug himself out of his own cabin and walked the half-mile to Walt's place in conditions that would have stopped a man 20 years younger, and he came down the ladder without ceremony and sat in the spot on the upturned crate he had claimed as his own through many months of afternoon visits, and said almost nothing for an hour, which was entirely consistent with who Neil Aldridge had always been. Reverend Silas Pruitt arrived in the afternoon on foot, his black coat turned completely gray with adhered snow. He descended the ladder with the deliberate care of a 70-year-old man unfamiliar with ladders, but unwilling to treat them as obstacles, and stood at the bottom and looked around the chamber with his steady measuring eyes. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence itself said something. "I owe you an apology, Walt," he said finally. Walt was at the stove tending the fire. He did not turn around. "No, you don't. I told you to lay low after Roy's hired man got hurt. You were protecting the community. That's your function. I was wrong about what it needed protecting from." Walt poured a cup and extended it across the space between them without turning fully. Pruitt took it. He looked at the walls, at the lamplight on the fitted stone, at the floor warm beneath his feet. "I'll say something on Sunday," he said, "about this, about what you built." "You don't need to." "I know," Pruitt said. "I want to." The chamber was full now. 5 men in a space built for one, arranged on crates and upturned buckets and the lower rungs of the ladder, each of them carrying some version of the same history, a winter they had not fully prepared for, a system they had dismissed that had turned out to be the only genuinely warm place in the valley, and the man who had built it, standing at the stove making coffee, as if having the valley's skeptics warm themselves in his underground room, was simply the natural end of a year's work. Walt moved among them quietly, tending the stove, managing the fire, making sure everyone had what they needed. He was not a man who performed hospitality. He simply ensured it. Eleanor had always understood this about him, that the small continuous acts of providing warmth and coffee and a place to sit were his way of expressing things he would never say aloud. That his care for people lived in his actions and not in his speech, and that the two should not be confused with each other. He thought she would have loved this particular afternoon. He thought she would have claimed the crate near the east wall and held her coffee going cold in her hands because she kept forgetting to drink it, and she would have watched these men filling the room. She had helped design men who had laughed at the idea of it, men who had doubted it, men who had walked through a blizzard to reach it, and she would have been too happy to say anything about any of it. He kept the fire steady and the coffee coming and said nothing that the warmth was not already saying. On the second day after the storm, while the valley was slowly beginning the work of digging itself back out, Walt went into the storage room. He had been thinking about the notebook for 2 days, about the last page, about the sentence Eleanor had left there, about the page before the last one that he had never read. He brought it to the small table and opened it to the back. He had read Eleanor's final sentence many times since October. "You'll know when it's time, Walt," until he knew it from memory, until it had become a kind of interior voice, a presence that occupied the space her absence had created by being a different quality of silence. He had taken it as encouragement, as trust, as the specific kind of love that prepares something useful rather than saying something beautiful. But he had not read until this morning the page before the last one. He could not fully explain why he had not. He had read everything else in the notebook, every annotation, every measurement, every correction, every margin note. But the second to last page had been turned past on each reading, not by intention, but by a momentum he had not examined until now. He read it now. The handwriting was different. Not her careful annotation script, but the looser, more personal hand she used for private things, letters, her journal, the handwriting of a woman writing for herself. The note was dated February 1888. 11 months before she died. "Walt doesn't know I've been working on this. He'd worry if he knew I was spending time on it instead of resting. But the notebook has been sitting in the tool chest for 15 years, and the ideas in it are too good to lose. He built all those things for the railroad and never thought to build them for himself. That's Walt. Builds the world for other people and lives in the ordinary version himself. I fixed the flue angle. The original design was for Montana conditions. The prevailing wind is different here. I've been tracking the wind direction for 3 winters now, keeping records. The corrected angle is in the margin on page 41. He'll find it when he's ready. The dark stone from the south bend of the creek is the right material. I tested it, kept pieces in the root cellar through 2 winters, and compared the temperature retention against the gray stone and the sandstone. No contest. He doesn't need to guess. I've done the experiment. I don't know when he'll build it. Maybe not while I'm here. Maybe that's all right. Some things need to wait for the right time. Walt will know when that is, even if he doesn't know he knows. He's always known more than he gives himself credit for. That's the other thing about Walt. Walt sat at the table. He sat for a long time. Outside, the valley was quiet in its post-storm stillness. The sky through the window had gone to the deep clear blue that came after Wyoming storms, when the air had been scoured clean of everything that was not sky. The notebook lay open on the table in the thin winter light, and the handwriting on the page was the handwriting he had been reading for 38 years, and it was talking to him from February of the year before she died from the winter, when she had known and he had not known, and she had prepared the thing and waited for the right time. She had known, not guessed known that the time would come, known that the knowledge in the railroad notebook was too good to lose, too specific and useful to leave unfinished in a tool chest, known with the patient certainty of a woman who had been paying close attention to the same man for 38 years, that Walt Greer was entirely capable of this and simply needed the right circumstances to understand that he was ready. She had corrected the flue angle for the specific wind of this specific valley. She had tested the stone. She had measured the temperature differential through multiple winters and recorded the results. She had done the foundational work, the work that made the rest of the work possible quietly, without mentioning it, without requiring acknowledgement, without knowing whether she would be present to see the result. He'll find it when he's ready. Walt pressed his hand flat against the page. He sat in the cold cabin and thought about Eleanor tracking wind direction through 3 winters out in the pasture with a compass and a notepad, recording what she observed. He thought about her in the root cellar with her stone samples and her makeshift temperature measurements, testing and comparing over 2 winters. He thought about her at the table late at night with the railroad notebook open, adding her small, precise corrections alongside his larger, rough sketches, improving what he had started in ways he had not thought to improve. He thought about 38 years of this, of her quiet, systematic, comprehensive attention to the things that mattered. The way she had paid attention to the creek and the mountains and the weather patterns. The way she had paid attention to him. He's always known more than he gives himself credit for. That's the other thing about Walt. He closed the notebook. He sat for another few minutes, not moving, letting the full shape of what he now understood settle into place. Not the grief that was unchanged and would remain so for the rest of his life, he understood that clearly, but the shape of what she had left behind. Not absence, not silence, preparation, a sentence waiting to be finished, a blueprint waiting to become a structure, a year of work that had been made possible by years of quiet watching. You'll know when it's time, Walt. He had known. He had been slower than she might have expected, perhaps, or exactly as slow as she had anticipated. She had known him long enough to account for his pace. But he had picked up the shovel in April and built the thing, and the thing worked, and it was November now, and the valley was full of men who had sat in his underground room and felt the warmth of the earth that she had measured and prepared and left for him to find. Walt stood up. He put on his coat and his boots and walked out through the back door and across the frozen yard and brushed the snow from the wooden door and descended the ladder. The chamber was warm and quiet. The stove held its small, steady fire. The stone walls held their stored heat. The floor was warm to the touch at the center and warm to the touch at the edges. 22 feet of stone passage ran its length beneath the clay floor, doing what the physics required it to do, indifferent to weather and to opinion, and to the long way around that Walt Greer had taken to arrive at this particular morning, in this particular place. He sat on the crate that had become his place in this room. He allowed himself something he could not have named precisely. It was not happiness and not peace and not resolution, but it contained elements of all three, and it was the closest thing to prayer he had been capable of since the January morning. He had broken Eleanor's grave from frozen earth with a pickaxe and understood that the world had permanently changed its shape. He let it be what it was. He did not try to name it or contain it or turn it into anything other than what it was. Then he built the fire up and put the coffee on. There was a full day of work ahead of him. There always was. Spring came to Harrow Creek Valley the following April. It came the way it always came, late, grudging the cold, retreating inch by inch up the mountain slopes, while the valley went slowly from white to gray, to brown, to the first particular green of things that have been patient long enough. The creek thawed from the edges, in the ice, darkening first, then softening, then breaking apart in the slow, heavy chunks that floated downstream toward the lower meadows, the sound of it low and irregular in the April quiet. Walt stood behind the cabin and watched it. He had his coffee. He did not forget to drink it. He drank it while it was still warm, standing in the April morning with the creek ice breaking below the south pasture and the cottonwood trees along the east pasture putting out their first tentative leaves 2 weeks early this year, a result of the hard winter breaking the dormancy cycle in some way that he did not fully understand, but that Eleanor probably would have. And he thought about telling her that the trees were early and remembered that he could not, and held both of those things, the early leaves and the impossibility of telling her without trying to resolve them into anything simpler than what they were. There it goes, he thought, another winter done. He heard boots on this frozen path and turned to find Dale Bassett coming around the corner of the cabin. Dale was alone and on foot, which was unusual, and he was carrying something under one arm, a cloth-wrapped bundle of a shape and weight Walt recognized before it was unwrapped. Dale stopped a few feet away. He had changed since November. Not dramatically, he was still the same broad, forward-leaning man who had laughed from the ridge in April of the previous year, but something in the way he carried himself was different, more deliberate, less automatic. The laugh had not been heard since the morning he had walked a mile and a half through a blizzard to reach a porch he had once ridden past without stopping, and some kinds of laughter, once a man understands what they cost, don't come back in the same form. "Morning, Walt." "Dale." Dale held out the bundle. "Roy and I want to build one, both of us. We've been talking about it since December." He paused for a moment. "Thought you might be willing to show us how it's done right." Walt took the bundle and folded back the cloth. A leather-bound notebook. New or nearly new blank pages, a cord tie the leather still stiff. Dale had stopped at the general store on his way over. Walt held it for a moment. He thought about Eleanor at the kitchen table late at night, the railroad notebook open in front of her, adding her careful annotations beside his rough sketches. He thought about her in the root cellar with her stone samples. He thought about the wind direction she had tracked for 3 winters, and the angle she had corrected, and the sentence she had left at the end of the page that had been waiting for him since February of 1888. He'll find it when he's ready. Walt opened the new notebook to the first page. He took the pencil from his coat pocket, the same pencil he had carried since his railroad years, worn down to 3 inches still sharp, and wrote at the top of the page, in his precise engineering hand, Harrow Creek Underground Kitchen, construction notes. Below that, he drew the first line of the flue diagram, the corrected angle, Eleanor's angle, the one calculated for the specific prevailing wind of this specific valley in this specific corner of Wyoming. He handed the notebook to Dale. "Copy this first," he said, "exactly as drawn, then we'll talk about the stone selection." Dale looked at the diagram with the focused seriousness of a man who has learned the cost of inattention and does not intend to pay it again. He nodded slowly. "Roy'll want to be here for this. Bring him. Bring anyone who wants to learn it correctly." Dale folded the notebook and tucked it under his arm. He looked at the underground kitchen entrance, the low wooden door, the small protective roof, the chimney pipe rising behind the cabin, and then he looked at the mountains above the valley, still white along the high ridgeline, still holding the last of a winter that had been hard in specific ways that the valley would not forget quickly. "Should have listened in April," he said. Walt looked at the mountains. "You listened when it mattered." Dale considered that, then he gave a short nod and walked back down the path toward the valley road. Walt watched him go. Emmett came out of the cabin behind him. He had been in Wyoming since November 1st in the Howell and Harrow Creek, and then without announcement or discussion at the cabin, occupying the back room and helping with the winter work and gradually becoming a presence that required no more explanation than the mountains did. He had written his company in Denver. He had not told Walt what he had written. Walt had not asked. Emmett stood beside his father and looked at the valley in the April light, the creek running full below, the hawks already on the thermals above the ridge, the new cottonwood leaves moving in the light wind. "How many do you think will build them?" he asked. "Most of them eventually," Walt said. "People take a while to act on what they know, but they know. You should have seen their faces in the chamber, during the storm, even Pruitt." "I saw them." "You weren't surprised." Walt drank the last of his coffee. It had stayed warm longer than he expected. "No." Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking at his father, "It was Ma's design, wasn't it?" "At least partly." Walt looked at the cottonwood trees and the spring light on the new leaves and the small wooden cross barely visible among the roots at the edge of the grove, the cross he had placed himself in January with frozen hands and a pickaxe. "Mostly," he said. Emmett nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has been working toward a conclusion for months and has arrived at it. That sounds right, he said quietly. That sounds exactly right. They stood together in the spring morning, the father and the son in the valley that had been home to one of them for 20 years and was becoming home again to the other in the way that some places call people back when the circumstances of their lives finally align with the shape of where they belong. The creek ran cold and full below the south pasture. The hawks turned their slow circles above the ridge. The first cottonwood leaves turned in the light wind bright and new, the color of things that have been waiting a longer time for their season. Behind the cabin, the chimney pipe rose from the ground, and the earth below it held its warmth, the way it held everything placed in its care, patiently without announcement, for as long as the physics required and longer. Reverend Pruitt said something about Walter Greer that Sunday as he had promised. He said it simply without elaboration in the way that the truest things are best delivered, not as a conclusion, but as an observation, the kind that settles into a community slowly, that people find themselves thinking about in quiet moments, long after they have forgotten where they first heard it. He said, "Some men build things for the world to see. Walt Greer built something for the world to feel. There's a difference between those two things. And this valley will be warmer for understanding it for a long time to come." By the following winter, 5 underground kitchens had been built in Harrow Creek Valley. The winter after that, 9 more. They were all built from the notes in Dale Bassett's new leather notebook. The one with Walt's diagram on the first page, the diagram with the corrected flue angle, the angle that accounted for the specific prevailing wind of this specific valley, worked out not at a drafting table or in a Union Pacific engineering office, but in the fields and pastures of Harrow Creek itself by a woman with a compass and a notepad and 20 winters of careful attention to the place she had chosen to live. Eleanor Greer's name was not on the notebook. Walt knew it was there. He knew it was in the angle of every flue that ran correctly underground in the valley. He knew it was in the choice of the dark stone from the deep bend south of the willow stand. He knew it was in the temperature differential between the root cellar floor and the cabin floor that she had measured across multiple winters and recorded in the margins of an old notebook she had taken from a tool chest and improved without being asked to, and returned without saying she had done so. He knew it was in every warm morning the valley would have in every winter that came after this one. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything.